You're listening to a CNA podcast.
You maybe didn't realise, but every 5 years, basically every country in the world is obliged to give new climate change targets, to be bold, promise more, lay out the next items of action to save the planet. And the latest deadline is upon us. Today, we're taking a roll call of who actually showed up on time. Hello and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm your host, Jack Board, and my lovely co-host is here too. Drum roll, it's Liling Tan back again.
Hello everybody. Hello, Jack Board. Lovely to be back here.
Hello to you. Now, were you a conscientious student? Did you do your homework on time?
Nope and nope.
Just a couple of years ago?
Nope.
I'm sure.
Nope. Not.
Oh, really?
I mean, competitive, yes. Conscientious, not unless I'm in it to win it.
Okay, so this explains like the last minute editing of some of our podcast work, right?
That's right.
All right, let's get straight into the quiz. Let's see if you've been doing your research on this particular topic, or whether you'll be looking over your friend's shoulder and stealing their answers, i.e. Google. Okay. It's pretty easy and straightforward this week, though. I want to know what percentage of countries have pledged or are officially considering a carbon net zero target of 2050. It's a popular choice in many countries, in line with the Paris Agreement. Is it 40%? 50%, 75%, or 90%? I want the answer now. No waiting around for the answer, because it is important, I think, for our main story discussion to know this.
All right, I'm going to go with 90% as the percentage of countries that have pledged or are considering pledging the 2050 net zero target.
A very optimistic answer from you, Liling, and it's incorrect. The answer is C, 75%. It's actually about 74.3%. 130 odd countries of the 190 that are locked into a 2050 goal. So there you go.
You know, I thought 90% because I thought a lot of the countries were just in the process, but maybe I'd overstate.
You have a lot of countries that might be kind of in line with it, but don't have that strict deadline. I think Singapore would be an example. They don't have a specific date. And then obviously countries like China and India that have pushed their target year back a little bit, given how difficult this net zero target is.
So you're saying we're worse off than I expected at the start of this podcast. Okay. Thank you for that.
Okay, yes, exactly. Okay, now for our main story this week. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are required to update their nationally determined contributions, or their NDCs, every 5 years. Paris was signed back in 2015, so roll around to 2025, it's time for governments to once again publish their new goals, basically describing how they plan to cut emissions and adapt to climate change. This time, the targets are set for 2035, a 10-year strategy of sorts. The idea is that ambition keeps ramping up. Each time new NDCs are submitted, more progress should have been made, and the next steps should cut emissions even more. This year's deadline was February 10. Check's calendar, that was pretty recent. Now, we did the quiz already, Liling. How many countries do you think actually submitted on time?
Okay. By the February 10th deadline, 13.
Unlucky 13, perhaps. Yeah, not a very good score. Only 13 of the 195 parties submitted their new NDCs on time. Now, only 2 of them are in the G7, that's the UK and the US. And of course, the US did this before the inauguration of Donald Trump, so now his government is in the process of withdrawing from Paris altogether, so those targets may not carry much water. Now, the other nations that did do their homework on time, Singapore, the UAE, New Zealand, Switzerland, Ecuador, Uruguay, Brazil, Andorra, St. Lucia, the Marshall Islands, and Zimbabwe.
You know, the fact that you have time on this podcast to read them all of them out, says it all really. That took, 5 seconds?
Yeah, and look at which countries they are. Some of them are very small, and significantly in numbers, the countries that didn't meet the deadline represent 83% of global emissions and nearly 80% of the world's economy. And if we took the US out of that as well, those numbers would be obviously much larger. That's according to analysis from Carbon Brief.
Wow, that's huge. A key question is how many of them are just running behind and how many are simply just not willing to increase their levels of ambition. We know that many more nations are likely to come forward with their new commitments, their new NDC goals before COP30 this November in Brazil, about 9 months from now. So, of course, COP30 is the annual massive UN climate summit. And it seems that most of these guys are just slow on submitting their homework. But there are also some sneaky signs that other countries won't be doing that.
Wow, what a privilege to just take an extra 9 months to submit your assignment. But yeah, who are these countries that are probably not going to be submitting anytime soon?
Well, for one, India. They've said already that they won't be increasing ambition and will only focus on adaptation. Now, China has been relatively silent about this. Australia is putting it off because of Trump. And then we have the indication that increasingly some countries don't want to be part of the process at all. And I'm looking at you, America, Argentina, Russia, even New Zealand is looking to join this group of dissenters.
Little rebels trying to get out of the Paris Agreement circus. I think we also have to pay attention, right, to what is being pledged in these NDCs. So, of the countries that have laid their plans on the table, according to Climate Action Tracker, only one of them, which is the UK, actually has plans that align with a 1.5 degree future. So basically the UK has pledged to cut its carbon emissions by 81% by 2035 relative to 1990 levels. A lot of advanced renewable energy infrastructure. They're big on offshore wind, looking at carbon capture and storage, a whole bunch of things. Of course, a lot of this is words on paper, but right now, the UK really out alone in terms of a 1.5 degree future. And I should note as well that Climate Action Tracker doesn't follow the policies of all countries. So some of the smaller countries that we mentioned haven't actually been analysed. They may have policies that do also align with a 1.5 degree future. So if these NDCs aren't actually that ambitious, then achieving the goals of Paris will be impossible if they're not already. And I think all of this is part of a growing suite of evidence that the current climate negotiating process, part of the UNFCCC, maybe it isn't really working. Now, both of us have covered COP29 extensively in Baku last year. I think there was a lot of disappointment and bitterness left in the aftermath of all of that. There's a deep gulf now that exists, especially between developing countries and richer nations. And as we discussed throughout Baku, the COP process may not be fit for purpose right now, given the heat that's in the argument, no pun intended. And Azerbaijan, which hosted COP29, notably one country falling behind on its own pledges, it was meant to have a net zero plan, a net zero by 2050 plan in time for COP29, and obviously that has come and gone, and we don't have anything from them.
What about our part of the world? I'd like to know what's happening with countries in our part of the world, because we know climate change is already affecting us every day. Why aren't nations here submitting their new NDCs? Where are the ASEAN members, the other ASEAN members on this list, Jack?
Right, so we saw that Singapore was the only one to submit on time. We know that the biggest regional polluter, which is Indonesia, has done a draft of its 2035 climate plans that hasn't yet been submitted to the UN. A lot is up for debate in Jakarta right now, a new government in place. The future of its vast coal infrastructure is up in the air a little bit after the president Prabowo Subianto pledged to retire all of the country's coal-fired power plants within the next 15 years and build a lot of renewables, which sounds super ambitious.
But it seems that may not actually be happening, right, Jack? His own brother just recently said that it's not true and it would be economic suicide to do so.
Yep. A lot of vested interests in Indonesia. This would be a big political football that gets kicked around. I'm sure we can see the ambition is there, but whether the economics actually make sense for Indonesia to do that, watch this space, I think.
And then we have Malaysia, which intends to submit before COP30. I think Thailand is still in the works, and we've had no updates from the Philippines and Vietnam.
Nope, nothing from them so far. We can probably focus on Singapore, though, given that it did make it on time and what's actually in these commitments.
For Singapore, I think it has committed to reduce emissions to between 45 and 50 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2035. And for context, in 2023, that number was 74.3 million tons. So it's quite a chunk. But there are some caveats for this to actually happen. One, the development of new technologies. Two, the success of global cooperation. And there's also a lack of detail. We don't know exactly how these cuts will really be made, right?
Yeah, that is the issue with a lot of the NDCs. They just don't get to the crux of how things will be done. Of course, that's complex and it's part of national legislation and reform agendas and various ministries in lots of different countries. But sometimes the detail can be a little bit scant. I think one thing we can hold on to, at least, is that the last time this happened, which was 2020, when the NDCs were due, actually only 5 countries made the deadline that time. And in the end, most parties did release something more or less in time for the next COP, which eventually was held in Glasgow. That was also in the middle of a global pandemic, though, so no such excuse this time around.
Can't say your dog ate your homework, huh?
The virus.
The virus ate. Okay, let's see how it unfolds. We'll be keeping an eye on this issue throughout the year as we count down to COP30 in Brazil.
Okay, now it's weather time, Li-Ling. What have we got in store?
Well, would you believe it, Jack? Scattered rain in Singapore for more of that.
Wow.
For more of that lovely dampness over the next few days. Hanoi has it better, though. Cool and cloudy for now. Jakarta, still wet and wild with more rain ahead. And hey, where you're at, Bangkok's coming out of that cold snap. Highs of 35 degrees. Sounds a bit hot, no? A little bit hot.
Yeah, I saw a forecast for the end of February, which says summer will be here already and temperatures up to 43 degrees. So, that's not the news I was hoping to hear.
Yucky. And I'm just going to include Sydney because your folks are listening. 50% chance.
Very kind.
You're welcome. 50% chance of rain today, tomorrow, and Saturday with highs of 26 degrees.
Lovely.
It's kind of nice.
Always. Okay, that's it for this episode of Climate Conversations. Thanks, as always, for being here. Give us some feedback. Give us your story ideas. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
And I'm Liling Tan. Catch us again next week. Same time, same place.
I'm Jack Board. Thanks, as always, as well, to the team that put together this podcast. Saye Win, Tiffany Ang, Janani Jahari, and Crispina Robert.